the whole month of January, we have been talking about the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, which I have printed in your bulletin because I know that we will forget. So, but we began, if you were not here, we began with the concept that life is suffering, that suffering is inevitable, and the concept that if we recognize this as we go through life, that everybody, regardless of who they are and how well off they look and how put together they seem, they still hurt inside somewhere over something, that all people suffer, and that can bring us to a place of greater gratitude and compassion if we can remember that. The second noble truth is that all of that suffering is really caused by craving and desire and attachment. It's our desire to have something happen the way we want it to happen, the way we want it to happen. It's our expectations and perceptions. And when we can begin to let go of all of those, because nothing is permanent, nothing is really in our control, those are the illusions that we like to tell ourselves. When we can start to let go of those, we can start to alleviate our own emotional suffering. The third noble truth is basically that when craving ceases, when our attachment ceases, that suffering ceases. And then the fourth is the Eightfold Path that gives us some guidelines to try and achieve that state of non-suffering. And so last week we talked about 3 of the Eightfold Path. We talked about right action and right speech and right livelihood very briefly. And today we're going to move on to right mindfulness, right effort, and right concentration. And then we'll be done. And there is no quiz at the end of it. Lucky you. Although we did have one a couple weeks ago, letting go is not just the goal, it is also the path. Good. If you learned nothing else, maybe that'll come to mind. So, Jack Kornfield is just a wonderful Buddhist teacher, psychologist. I love his books. They're very accessible, easy to read. I would encourage anybody to pick one of these up. This is called The Wise Heart, and he's talking about mindfulness. Mindfulness is attention. It is non-judging, respectful awareness. That should be our quiz for today. Mindfulness is non-judging, respectful awareness. Can you say that? Mindfulness is non-judging, respectful awareness. Perfect. Remember that, because I may not. Unfortunately, much of the time we don't attend in this way. Instead, we continually react, judging whether we like, dislike, or can ignore what's happening. We evaluate ourselves and others with a stream of expectations, commentary, and criticism. When we are mindful, it's as if we can bow to our experience without judgment or expectation. Mindfulness, declared the Buddha, is all helpful.
Reading from the book of Philippians. Finally, my sisters and brothers, your thoughts should be wholly directed to all that is true, all that deserves respect, all that is honest, pure, decent, admirable, virtuous, or worthy of praise. Live according to what you have learned and accepted, and what you have heard me say and seen me do. Then will the God of peace be with you.
Would you pray with me? Attentive Spirit, as we attempt to focus our minds and our hearts on this moment, help us to let go of all of our distractions, all of our judgments, all of our fears, so that we might simply be in this place and be open to those things that you would have us learn, those ways you would have us grow this morning. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be filled with your light and your wisdom. Amen. So while we've been talking about the Four Noble Truths, we've also been making the connection to Christian scriptures and spirituality. And you can see that there are many, many parallels. I think last week particularly lent itself to some of those scriptural parallels as we talked about right speech and right action, especially when we get into the do unto others as you would have them do unto you kind of piece. This week, as we talk about right mindfulness or right awareness, same thing, right concentration and right effort, it's a little bit harder to find some of those connections. As I've studied the different world religions, it's been apparent to me that each has its own strength, and each has its own emphasis that you don't necessarily find in the other. And in Buddhism, the concept of mindfulness is a very strong spiritual emphasis that really, in my opinion, is sorely lacking in Christianity. One of the few scriptures I could find that sounded like it fit was the one that Marilyn read from Philippians, which said that, we should be wholly directed on that which is true. It's take all of our focus and all of our effort and try and maintain a connection with the truth of life beyond the illusion. But to me, even that scripture falls a little bit short of what we're trying to get at with the concept of mindfulness. And mindfulness is really the linchpin. It's the key to everything we've been talking about. Mindfulness is that which helps us to remember that everybody suffers. Mindfulness is what we bring to ourselves and our attention to what we're thinking and feeling that helps us realize where our attachments and our clinging and our grasping is. Mindfulness is what helps us to remember to speak and to act well, nicely, without harming others. It all comes down to mindfulness. And mindfulness is, back to your quiz, mindfulness is non-judging and respectful awareness. Let's do that again. Mindfulness is non-judging and respectful awareness. See, we can't even remember what it is. How are we supposed to do it? It's such an important piece in our spiritual paths because it brings us back to a loving center. It constantly brings us back from our egos and our fears and our worries and has us take a look at what's going on from a place of non-judgment, respectful awareness. So in all of our experiences, in all of our interactions, we're coming at it from a place of trying to understand, of trying to make connection, of trying to see where somebody else is instead of making immediate judgments. I know I've said this to you before, but in the first 7 seconds that you meet somebody new, you make 11 judgments about them. I think that's pretty impressive. That's more than one judgment a second. But how are you supposed to be mindful if all your mind is doing is this stream of judging when you come across someone or you come across a situation? That's the antithesis to being mindful. The key to being mindful is stopping. Which is why meditation is a key foundational practice in Buddhism. Because just in the little meditation that I had you do, could you feel a difference in your bodies? Could you feel a difference in your focus as you're focusing purely on loving kindness to yourself and to all other beings? It changes the place from which we operate. Connects us back to spirit and to life and to light and to compassion. And so that stopping is an important piece in Buddhist practice, but just in life. Mindfulness means taking an emotional step back from whatever's going on and trying to be the observer. Doesn't mean you don't feel, it doesn't mean you don't care, but it means that you're taking a deliberate step back to see from a greater perspective, and to try and understand what's all going on from a place of clarity. Now, I know I'm not going to get all of you to start practicing meditation. So even if that's not your thing, even if that 2-minute thing we did with the kids is not going to happen in your life, I do believe that it's possible to cultivate mindfulness by simply being more conscious as we walk through life and less on autopilot. By not allowing ourselves the knee-jerk reactions and the unbidden and uncensored judging and criticism and opinion that tends to run through our heads. There's a story about Buddha and his attendant Ananda. And the story is that Buddha and Ananda were walking through the forest on one hot summer day. And Buddha stopped and said, Ananda, we need something to drink. So would you go back to the river that we just crossed a few miles back? And would you bring us some water? And so Ananda walked back to the river to get some water. And when he got there, he found that a bunch of wagons had just crossed through the river and had stirred up all of the mud at the bottom of the river. So the river was all dirty and icky and unfit to drink. So he returned to Buddha and explained what had happened and why he was empty-handed. He said, but you know, I hear there's a river a couple miles down, and so if we just keep going, you just keep walking, I'll go ahead, I'll go get some water for us. And Buddha said, no. He said, I want you to go back to the river, and if it hasn't cleared yet, I want you to just sit and watch. Because sooner or later, the water will clear. And so Ananda went back, and sure enough, the river was much clearer than it was before. It wasn't quite to drinking stage, so he sat down on the banks of the river and he watched until the water was clear, and then he took some and he brought it back. But in the process of all that, he came to the understanding that mindfulness is about waiting and about being present and being aware until clarity comes and you can act in a situation from a place of knowing what's the obvious right thing to do. Because your water is not muddied anymore, it's clear. And I think we can do that in our lives if we are conscious and aware and attend to that. So I want you to try something with me, okay? I want you to think about the person who drives you nuts. That one person in your life that you see coming and you want to go the other direction. That one person who pushes all of your buttons. That one person you have to deal with, but you know it's not going to be fun every time you have to deal with them. You got your person yet? Because we usually all have one. Okay, now, I want you to picture the next time you see this person, that you are going to approach this person from a place of mindfulness. Well, what does that mean? That means non-judging, God bless you, Shirley, and respectful awareness. So, it means that when you see this person, you are going to take a deep breath. You see them coming, you take a deep breath. You take an emotional step back, find your center in loving kindness, and try to simply be aware of what they are saying and doing without judging it, without taking it personally, without becoming suddenly defensive, or feeling like you have to go on the attack. You are simply going to note what they have to say from a place of non-judging, respectful awareness. And as you do this, you will notice and remember that they too are a human being with their own set of dukkha, or suffering. That they may be going through things that you're completely unaware of. You are going to remember that they are probably operating out of their ego and their fears and their concerns and whatever is going on with them, and they probably have no clue that they're operating from that place. And so as you've taken this step back, you're waiting for the water to clear as you're listening to them and noting what's happening. And if you're getting triggered, if they pushed your button, if you're starting to get angry, if you're starting to get annoyed, if you're starting to feel defensive, you're also going to bring that non-judging, respectful awareness to yourself. Say, oh, look at that. Look, I'm getting really defensive about this. I wonder what that's about. And you're going to go, I'm going to think about that later, but I'm going to think about that later because I want to know why I'm reacting that way. And even if this person is angry and abrasive and dismissive or whatever they're being, you don't need to get sucked in because you're standing here watching and going, oh, isn't this interesting? Look, they're becoming abrasive and angry and they're looking for a rise out of me, it appears, and I can just watch this. And if you have to, you're going to take a deep breath and you're going to continue to shelve whatever it's triggering in you to deal with later. And you're going to wait and watch for the water to clear so that you can react and respond from a place of clarity with right speech and right action. So how does it feel to have that kind of interaction instead of your typical interaction? Better? Do you think it's possible? Do you think any of you could do that? Okay. So assuming that you could do that, what do you think might get in your way of doing that? What keeps us from being mindful? Ego. Our judgments. Habit.
Exhaustion.
Exhaustion. Yeah. If I haven't slept and haven't eaten. Yeah. What did you say, Robin?
Fear of being hurt.
Fear of being hurt. Sure. Does our culture encourage us to wait?
No.
Does our culture encourage us to think or just to respond? To just respond. We're encouraged to be quick-witted and right in there and just to respond and to take care of ourselves and to be independent and whatever that means. And that just means we can just step all over anybody else. And this is asking us to do something counter-cultural, counterintuitive perhaps even. But it feels better when you do it that way, doesn't it? Even in your head, it feels better. And I know it's not easy. But the more we do it, the better we get at it. Which brings us to right effort, which says we simply keep trying and working on being mindful. I read one story about a woman who said that her husband was a well-known Hindu teacher, and he went to India. He had an amazing experience in India. He came back and he was centered and he was grounded and he was living in this amazing place of kind of enlightenment. She said, he was like that for about 6 months, and then he spent time with his mother. So right effort says we don't necessarily judge that, okay? It says we take note of that, mindfulness, we take note of that, but we're just going to try again. Right effort says we're not going to be able to do this 100% of the time, maybe not even 50, 25% of the time, but we're going to keep trying. In traditional Christianity, unfortunately, way too much, in my humble opinion, is said about the sinful nature of human beings. So like if we mess up, we make a mistake, oh, you're a sinful, horrible human being. If you work on a spiritual practice or spiritual discipline and you don't meet your goal, oh, you're a failure, you're a miserable, rotten human being. Buddhism has a completely different take on things. I was reading this amazing book called Meeting Faith, and it's a spiritual autobiography of a young woman who was half white, half African American, and dropped out of Harvard, went to Thailand to study, and ended up becoming a Buddhist nun for a year. And it's her experience of trying to become mindful and trying to understand what was going on with herself and trying to follow the practices. It's a fascinating, fascinating book. But she talks about the vows that they had to take when they became a nun and all of the rules that they had to follow. And one of the rules was that whatever letters they sent from the place had to only have worthy topics in it. So basically their letters were kind of censored. So after a year had gone by and she was ready to leave, packing up her stuff, getting ready to go, two of the other young women nuns came to her and kind of surreptitiously slid her a letter to mail once she got out. And the first one, slid it to her and said thank you. And she said, I haven't agreed to do this. And the woman said, well, but all of our letters are censored. And Faith just kind of let it sit there. And then another woman came and slid her a letter and said, thank you. And she had a really hard time with it. She thought, first of all, she was really disappointed at these other nuns for breaking their practice. And second, she wasn't sure she wanted to be a part of helping them to harm their own spiritual discipline or be a part of that deceit. And sitting with that and becoming mindful of that, she eventually came to understand that really the only person that they were hurting was themselves, and the only promise they were breaking was their own covenant with themselves. That Buddhism was not about sinfulness, but Buddhism was about practice. And so the lesson for us is that, if we fail, we just keep practicing. It's not that we have to beat ourselves up for it. It's not that we have to give up. We just have to be aware and keep practicing. Nolan has a wonderful sticker on his cello that says, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. Well, how do you get to mindfulness and enlightenedness and awareness? Practice, practice, practice. It's the same thing, and it's the path, the spiritual path. So the third thing that I'm mentioning only briefly is right concentration. Right concentration simply says that when you are in a place of right mindfulness, it's a whole lot easier to concentrate, to be focused without being distracted by your ego and your fears and your worries and your expectations and your judgments and everything else. And so the more you are able to focus, the more peace you find. All of these practices are about spiritual liberation and freedom from those things that cause us to suffer, and a freedom to know more deeply the spirit that moves within each of us. So I leave you with all of that. And if some of it made sense, great, take it, use it, practice. Hopefully you will find some more peace. And if it doesn't make any sense, well, let it go. But I personally think that all of these things we've talked about can be utilized to bring us a much deeper connection to the divine and a much deeper interior peace. And hopefully world peace. Amen.